pleasure to be here with you at the North Capitol Forum. I want to thank the USMF and Enrique Perret and his whole team for the kind and generous invitation to moderate this wonderful panel, which will be talking about the implications of democracy for economic cooperation in the North American region. As all of you know, 2024 is a critical moment for North America. Every 12 years, the US and Mexico, their elections coincide, and that is true this year. And as we all know, and for those of you that were here on October 1st, Mexico inaugurated its first female leader, and the US is just about to have its presidential elections on November 5th. And Canada's positioned to also hold national elections in 2025. And so we really are at a critical juncture for the future of North American integration, and the decisions that the next leaders of the region will take will determine what the integration will look like, especially ahead of the 2026 USMCA review and on issues that are so important, salient as trade, migration, and security. And so today I have the honor of moderating a wonderful panel with incredible experts. We are joined by Pablo Covalesi, Chairman of the Board, Mexican Association of Private Equity, AMEXCAP, and Managing Partner of PC Capital. Stephen Weymouth, got it right. Provost Distinguished Associate Professor and the Dewey Award Fellow of the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. We are also joined by Francisco Santos, Vice President of Colombia from 2002 to 2010, and Ambassador of Colombia to the United States from 2018 to 2021. And finally, we have Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez. He is a Managing Director of Aurora. And so to kick off the panel, I'm going to start with you, Francisco. You have delved into issues of migration, and I think a lot of what we've discussed today is, and yesterday at yesterday's dinner, for those of you who attended, is this need for trilateral cooperation on issues of migration. So how can North America, how can we change migration from a problem to an opportunity? And really, what can the US and Canada do in the near future? Why don't we start with that big topic with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first start by saying that a ticking bomb is going to explode very soon, and it's the 7 million Venezuelans that are going to leave Venezuela in next year. There's a survey that they did on Venezuela, and 30% of Venezuelans said, if Maduro stays, I leave. And those 7 millions are not going to stay in Colombia because Colombia is saturated. They're not going to go to Argentina. They're going to move straight to the U.S. So you're going to have that problem. And it's and I've been talking to people saying, oh, we're seeing the Venezuelans here. Get ready to have that 5, 6, 7 more times in a very, very short time. As a matter of fact, today there are 10,000 Venezuelans leaving Colombia every day. 10,000. What we saw in 2019 and 2020 is going to replicate with a difference, and it's that they're moving up, all of them north. In 2019, they moved to Colombia, they went down, and part of it went north. But now it's going to be different. So you're going to be living on the edge. That's a big edge you're going to be living in very, very soon. And it's going to fall on Mexico, without a doubt. Obviously, migration is a very big political issue. But I think Mexico can play a fantastic role if it really sets its mind into saying, look, why don't we work a policy of migration with the US, in which the nearshoring, which is booming here, and a lot of the lower added value companies can settle in different countries than Mexico. Mexico will do nearshoring with the high value, which is happening, but there's a lot of lower value that can move to the rest of Latin America. I think Colombia is a perfect example because Colombia is a buffer country. And out of that, you say, one condition, you manage migration. You become managers of migration so they don't come up, so they can become adapted, et cetera. You create a set of rules. Those are the type of issues and policies that can become a reality. It's very tough in today's world, to be very sincere. I'm not very hopeful. But I think Mexico can play that game. But obviously, it would have to be done with the US and Canada in a certain sense. But migration is going to become a huge issue here. It's going to become a huge issue in the approval of the renewal of the MCA. And I think we're going to be discussing this issue many times over for the next years.
Totally. And I think one of the main issues on the agenda, especially with the U.S. and Mexico, has been migration cooperation, which has actually expanded and has been strengthened in the last few years. Pablo, let me go to you. Mexico became the U.S.'s top trading partner last year with two-way trade totaling just shy of $800 billion. How do you see trade coming to North America in the near future in terms of USMCA? What is your perspective of how trade is going to look like in the next several years?
First of all, a big thank you to the North Capitol Forum for the invitation. Pleasure to be here, Lila. Yes, so cooperation comes in many ways, and for sure, one of those avenues for cooperation is trade. As you rightly point out, Mexico has become the most important trading partner of the United States, and I think that has a lot of implications for the next 6 years of the new government for sure, but I think way beyond that. Mexico has really positioned itself not only as a very, very important commerce partner of North America, a partner of the United States and Canada, but also a critical country in terms of international commerce. We're just coming off of the pandemic, and what we saw was that the supply chain of North America got disrupted. Mm-hmm. And we all lived through this. You would go to the supermarket or the convenience store and you weren't able to find your goods. Or you would go out and buy a car and you just couldn't find inventory for a car in the United States. And what we're seeing now is that as a product of the tensions in between, geopolitical tensions in between, especially the United States and China, the big winner out of those tensions has been Mexico, because trade is just going to continue to favor Mexico because, neither the Republicans or Democrats want to see that supply chain getting broken again. And if the United States, in terms of national security, wants to secure that supply chain and have goods and services out in the market, international trade and cooperation in between Canada, the United States, and Mexico has to continue, and it has to continue to grow.
Completely agree. And kind of staying on that trade issue, Stephen, I'd love to ask you, one of the big questions I think on all of our minds is what's going to happen with the elections in the United States and what that's actually going to mean for its North American partners at such a critical moment, not only in trade, but migration, security, and other issues that are so important regionally. So what is your take on what we can expect in November?
Right. So thanks for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to kind of build on Pablo's point and speak a little bit about the complicated politics of trade in the United States and why it's so complicated in this moment of time. It turns out we have an election coming up, you might have heard, and both candidates running for president are fairly protectionist. And this is just highly unusual in American politics, certainly in the modern era. And so we might ask ourselves kind of what's going on here. Well, it turns out that the Electoral College map is playing an enormous role here. The United States has gone through about 5 decades of a process of deindustrialization in which about 10 million manufacturing jobs have been lost, have been shipped overseas, have been eliminated. And the United States had its manufacturing employment peak in the late 1970s, but even in other measures like in industrial output, we haven't reached the peaks of the pre-financial crisis levels since then. So there's been essentially no growth in industrial output. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because communities have suffered as a result of this deindustrialization process. Oftentimes factories are tied very much to a local community, and when that factory shuts down for whatever reason, for offshoring, because of trade competition or what have you, many people in those communities lose out. So we've tried to ask ourselves, what are these communities that have been most hardest hit? And we've looked at the data and we found that many of them are located in swing states. Now, what are swing states? Swing states are the states that you have to win if you want to win the US presidency. And why are they swing states? Well, they're swing states because they swing between Democrats and Republicans oftentimes. And they often vote against the incumbent. And why do they do that? They do that because they're unhappy with the status quo. The neoliberal policy of the last 3 decades hasn't worked out for them. And so imagine that here we are the day after the election, 1 month from now, and imagine that I wasn't paying attention to the election. I could ask you one question. I could say, who won Pennsylvania? And with that information, I would know with about 90% certainty who the next president will be. Why is Pennsylvania so relevant? It's relevant because it has an important set of electoral college votes, and it's important because it's one of the swing states that has suffered from deindustrialization. How does that affect policy? Well, both candidates want to win Pennsylvania, they want to win Michigan, they want to win Ohio, they want to win Wisconsin. All of these states have suffered manufacturing job losses. And so their policies are reflecting the interests of the voters in those states. And those voters in those states aren't particularly keen on globalization. And for that reason, you see the rhetoric really ramping up now in the next month, and has been over the last several months, of this anti-trade, anti-globalization agenda. Whether or not that continues in the next term, the first term of the next president, or the second term, we'll have to wait and see, but it presents a lot of challenges because regardless of who wins, their party or themselves is going to want to win the next election. And until we do something about the discontent in the swing states as a result of trade exposure and manufacturing job losses, we're going to always have this political resistance to further integration, including in North America. Yeah, I think there's we can get into a lot of specifics here, but I think in general, I think that both candidates are broadly supportive of it. You know, the Trump administration renegotiated it, and I anticipate that they will continue to support it if he wins. I believe that she will as well. There are going to be certain items of contention related in particular to local content requirements. So what's happened now with the China tariffs is they placed borders on the Chinese ability to export some of their products to the United States. And China's very keen on circumventing those tariffs by going through Mexico. And so that's going to be certainly an area where the United States is going, either Harris or Trump, is going to try to make that more and more difficult by raising the local content requirements of goods that are able to cross the borders without tariffs. So I think that's going to be the main item of contention.
Thank you. Daniel, I want to ask you about some democratic trends. Looking further than North America into sort of Latin America, you know, what is the region looking at in terms of democracy and democratic trends as it pertains to Mexico? I found it incredibly telling. I don't know if some of you attended the last session where the chairman of the Canadian Business Council was saying that the top issue that kept his clients awake at night was the state of democracy, especially in North America. And I think that's true with certain other countries in Latin America. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of a broader overview of the state of democracy and how they're looking at North America and Mexico in particular.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to thank the forum for putting together these really important conversations that, as everybody mentioned, are happening at a very sort of critical time in terms of the sort of development of both the political and economic spheres of the various North American countries. Mexico has been essentially playing on easy mode for the last 5 years. The number of positive externalities, whether it be the fact that hugging the eagle on the China issue is one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on in a very polarized time. The fact that Brazil and some of the other competitors in the region are having a lot of sort of growing pains. The fact that it is almost impossible to find a country that is as well adapted to aeolic solar energy sources as Mexico could in theory be under different government. It is jaw-dropping. I have never seen anything like it anywhere in Latin America where the externalities all line up in favor of one country's success. That success has not truly been realized, in part because Latin America, you know, tends to set off a lot of warning bells in the minds of investors generally. And something that Mexico, I would say, had before all of these externalities took place, it doesn't quite have now, was a sort of sense of exceptionalism. This idea that investing in Mexico is really not like investing in Latin America. Yes, they speak Spanish, there's some similar demographics, a lot of them, maybe look the same, sound the same, but it is different because the US has more importance there, because the private sector ties are that much deeper, because the institutions, while not perfect, have been around for a long time and probably aren't going anywhere. And a lot of that sheen, I'd say, has been lost, which means that Mexico now, has a certain amount of risk priced in regionally that probably wasn't priced in 5-6 years ago. And I think that that's something that Mexico has struggled to come up with a narrative for. And is continuing to struggle with, because in the past you could say, well, our judiciary fixes things. So if we have populist overreach in the executive, well, there's sort of these training wheels on the bike, so we can't really fall over. Yes, we won't move as fast, but at the end of the day, you won't lose everything. And that argument's not quite working as well with investors as it used to. Now, I would say that coming into the next sexenio, Mexico still kind of has it on easy mode, but less in terms of the economics as in the politics. The breakdown of Venezuela, which will, as Ambassador Santos was saying, exacerbate migration, that's actually good for Mexico in terms of it gives you something that you can tell the US you can help them with or not help them with, depending on how the US wants to play it. It gives them leverage, and that's something that in the last government we saw used quite a bit. And I would expect it to happen in the next government as well. The issue of, for example, regionally, you continue to see a lot of exceptionalism in Mexico in terms of the institutions. It is almost impossible to find an executive as powerful as Mexico's is right now. In nearly every other country in Latin America, the real risk no longer comes from the executive, it comes from the judiciary. If someone's going to expropriate the biggest copper mine, it's no longer the executive, because executives are having a hard enough time not getting impeached, let alone getting reelected or having their party keep power. Congresses are very powerful in places like Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, but they're acephalous. They can't really do anything proactively, which means that you end up with a big power vacuum that ends up becoming, sort of an avenue for judicialization, and the courts start acting more like gringo courts do, and legislating because nobody else can do anything. Sometimes that's good. In Colombia, people are very happy that the court's there and that every crazy idea that Petro gets struck down by the court. In Argentina, the business community is furious that there's all this risk that even if you get Congress on board, the court's going to step in. So there is an argument that judicial overreach is the problem in Latin America, just not Mexico. Because in Mexico, you have... But, well, that's what the Reforma's about, right?
Yeah.
So you have this executive that is more powerful than any other executive in the region, that is doing something that any other country probably has to do to some level, but it is something that is creating very bad optics. And I think that that's really the challenge for the new Sheinbaum government, is going to be create a new narrative. Latin American markets do not run on numbers because nobody trusts our numbers. They run on narratives. Tell me a story of why this makes money. And Mexico has struggled to do that. I'd say the last administration that got that right was probably Cedillo. And I was a teenager during Cedillo. It's very difficult to find a government that has managed to square that knot. And I'd say that, what is going to make the difference between, victory in the newest iteration of easy mode and another missed opportunity, as I would say the last sexennial has been, at least in terms of really, bringing those nearshoring, fruits to, fruition, I think is going to be that narrative. And that can come out of the private sector, and I think the private sector has traditionally done a slightly better job, but it really needs to come out of government, because that's where the leverage, I would say, is. You have had a window of opportunity during the last 5 years in which El Peje didn't really care about the private sector or the North. So you have essentially the Wild West to a certain extent, which has been a huge opportunity. It's been a boom time for a lot of the maquila areas. That is no longer necessarily the case. And that sort of raises the biggest question, to what extent does the idea, which is a very Latin American idea, in which you do the dedazo and then you stick around when the new person takes over. That's not New Colombia. You guys went through that, but not too long ago, in fact. But the rejection of the past came on day one. And we haven't seen that because it's day 2 now. So, what that's going to look like, whether, we're going to see an extension of an AMLO ex-presidency todopotente, or whether we're going to see something new with Sheinbaum other than tonal, I think that's the main question, because a lot of those Latin America risks that weren't priced in before are now being priced in for Mexico because of the optics. And that's, I'd say, the challenge.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, Francisco, I know you wanted to come in here.
I'd like to add something because I agree absolutely that migration can become a thing that gives leverage to Mexico. But there's another issue, which is the elephant in the room that you need to talk about and that gives a lot more leverage to the U.S. drug trafficking.
Se me acabó el tiempo.
Nobody talks about it. Sheinbaum in her discourse said nothing about security, and it's become a huge issue. And you're seeing all over Latin America, everybody saying, Jesus Christ, the Mexican cartels are now in Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, everywhere. Ecuador. And it's becoming a big, big continental issue, and here, nobody talks about it. So I think that's going to become a huge, huge political, economic, and security discussion between the U.S. and Mexico in the very near future. And I'm surprised that it hasn't become an issue of the rest of the countries in Latin America with Mexico, because you're seeing the cartels all over Latin America.
No, and I think security is, right, the third pillar we were going to get into. So thank you, Francis. Thank you so much. And I do agree with you. And I hate being a moderator because then I don't know how to not be a panelist. So apologies. I just want to get in there. It's terrible. But no, I think I agree with you. But I do believe that there is this sort of cautious optimism that the Sheinbaum administration will, bring on a shift in terms of security strategy than her predecessor. Yet to be seen, but I think her 100-point plan points to a very different security strategy, although the National Guard still falls under the Ministry of Defense. But anyway, yes, Pablo, do you want to jump in?
And I think, Lila, this is exactly where the conversation really gets interesting, right? So, yes, we do have a migration issue. There's a bomb about to explode. Yes, there are protectionist issues that we got to deal with, for sure. It was a big debate when NAFTA was first passed in the late 90s. So that issue is there yet to be resolved, and we'll have to deal with that. There's a revision of the USMCA coming up. And yes, we do have a judiciary that is losing independence. Let's, spell it out. It's a reality, and we got to acknowledge it. And so what's going to happen, right? And I think our view, I can tell you what investors are looking at. Mm-hmm. Because yes, the private sector, I think, is the balance that is going to lead to cooperation, in our view. What we're seeing today is that the world is now becoming a place in which trading blocs are starting to form and reformat again. And the North American bloc is only going to be reinforced. And it doesn't really matter whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris wins the next election. Doesn't really matter whether we have a new president in office today in Mexico. I think that with a high degree of uncertainty, we can say that even if we take into account all of these issues, the North American bloc has to strengthen and will strengthen itself. Why? Because the U.S. is not going to be able to deal with its problem on its own, i.e., all of that manufacturing, in excess of $300 billion that was shipped on an annual basis to China. They can't repatriate that to the United States. Only it has to be distributed because of different reasons, mainly costs, right? And so that has to be repatriated to North America, and there's got to be further cooperation for trade. And in Mexico, the way in which this country is going to resolve its own problem, which is the 6% deficit that we all know about, is by bringing in private investment. And private investment is going to be the swing that is going to bring in the revenues into this country in order to operate with a balanced budget. So from a private investment standpoint, I think we'll continue to attract investment to fuel the local economy and also to fuel the companies that have positioned themselves to export to the United States and also to Canada mainly.
So,
But-
yeah, I'll go to you, Stephen. But Pablo, just to push you a little bit on that, right? I do agree that the North American bloc will be strengthened, but I do believe as well that all countries need to establish the right conditions to attract that FDI and to benefit from nearshoring. And you need legal certainty, and you need a skilled workforce, and you need access to energy, and you can't have high levels of insecurity, to Francisco's point, right? So I think those are issues that I think a lot of investors are also looking, in particular in Mexico, and I think are alarmed with some of the issues that are occurring currently. And so, Stephen, I actually want to ask you, what do you think the perspective? I mean, I know Mexico, especially in migration in terms of security and fentanyl, sort of at the forefront of the campaign cycle in the United States. But what issues do you see both candidates or the next president of the United States really working closely with Mexico and Canada, for that matter?
Yeah, right. So I think most of us in this room are interested in what are the ways in which integration can be facilitated in North America, and the question, I think one of the questions we want to ask, and building on your point, is what are the institutions that are going to help facilitate that investment? What are the institutions that are going to raise investor confidence? What are the institutions that are going to be consistent with this really important agreement, USMCA, that we have spent decades now ironing out? In order to help that integration occur and facilitate and create incentives for private investment. And so I'm going to pose this question kind of to the group because I'm not sure I have an answer on this yet, and I'm not sure it's difficult at this point, I think, to fully understand what the reforms mean, the constitutional reforms. But my sense is that there's this tendency here towards both judicial and regulatory centralization that could pose both problems on the legal side in terms of provisions of USMCA, but also raise investors' concerns about things like the independence of different regulatory decision making and so on. And so certainly on the legal side, for instance, Article 21 of USMCA says each country must have an independent competition agency. So if COFECE is dissolved, where does that leave Mexico in terms of that obligation under Article 21? So that's just one example, right? So those are the questions that are on my mind right now, and I hope that some of us maybe have some additional thoughts on
And
that.
some other thorny issues like genetically modified corn and state-owned enterprises. I think there's a lot of issues on USMCA that are thorny, right? As it relates to Mexico and its North American partners. Pablo, do you have something?
Yeah, if I may react real quickly, I think those are all, Lila, those are real issues, and we can't cover them up. Those are real issues that need to be resolved. And I think we just heard President Sheinbaum 2 days ago acknowledge some of those issues. And she did recognize we do have an issue with the cartels. She recognized that we do have an opportunity that can't go away with cooperating with the United States. And she recognized that the rule of law is critical. So I think that she's smart enough, or she was smart enough to recognize those needs and those issues right off the bat. Of course, we're very early in the game. We've yet to see how those good intentions are going to materialize. But I think that we cannot afford, as a country, Mexico, not to acknowledge those issues, not to be real careful about how we revise the USMCA and how we take care of our domestic content for that opportunity not to go away.
Thank you. Yes, Daniel, go ahead, please.
So I agree with everything that's been said, but I'd say that the main issues for Mexico right now are, I'd say, there is an exaggeration and a polarization. None of them is an issue that cannot be solved. Even the cartel issue, I mean, it's been here for a long time. And it's, from a sort of cynical private sector standpoint, it's often pretty easy to price in. If the cartel dynamics are relatively stable, you sort of know what you're getting into. through. And in some cases, if cartels have been there long enough, they're almost like a backup self-funding ministry in some ways. And that is, that's always been sort of the situation, right? The issue right now is there's just uncertainty because, Sinaloa seems like it's falling in on itself, and Jalisco Nueva Generación has a very different mentality in terms of the role of a cartel regionally. And so I think that those sorts of narratives are what really spook investors. And it's the same as with the judiciary. We all know a change is happening, but it's difficult to really price in what that change is going to look like because it's not quite old PRI, because old PRI was, for all its sins, very institutional, right? It's right there in the name. Whereas this is much more personalistic than old PRI. And that also affects the executive, obviously, because traditionally when you have an ex-president who still has a lot of sway over a new president, then what will happen is that the new president has to carve out niches that the ex-president doesn't care about. And that's where you can really make an impact, or else you lose your legislative support and can't get anything through. The good thing about López Obrador is that everybody knows what El Peje cares about. It's, energy and El Tren Maya. And when he doesn't care about something, he is very clear that he does not care about that thing. And so there's lots of things that a Sheinbaum administration could focus on, things that need to be done. The question is, I don't see a very good match between those things and the things of biggest concern to investors. So if you have a Sheinbaum administration that just functions as a sort of AMLO light that brings in some really good new technocrats compared to the outgoing administration and has a little bit more to talk about on social policy in agreement with, say, a US Democratic administration, that's good. That's marginally positive, but it's not, I think, going to allay a lot of those really difficult to price in uncertainties that markets aren't used to having when they think about investment in Mexico. Because before it was just, the price of the peso. That's the one thing we have to worry about. That is no longer the way that markets are viewing Mexico. It's like number 4 on the list. And that's with a very volatile peso, obviously. So.
Well, and you just said something that AMLO was very strong about, sort of the issues that he didn't like. And one of it was when the Supreme Court, shut down a lot of the bills that he wanted to push forward. So, Francisco, I wanted to ask you, what is your perspective on the judicial reform that was just approved in Congress, that was set into law by the president before he left office? What kind of implications do you see for the future of economic cooperation with the US and Canada for Mexico?
You're starting to hear investors say, wow, where's judicial security? And it's not that there wasn't judicial security before, because nothing, the judges, nothing happened. Now it becomes politicized. Mm-hmm. The judicial system becomes a branch of the Morena party. That's what's going to happen. Because Morena created a huge political machine that is going to elect the judges. So the judges are not going to obey the law, but are going to obey Morena. And that's an extreme thing, but I think it's going to become the narrative, and it might happen, and it creates huge uncertainty regarding democracy here. I think we're moving to a new PRI, more modernized, but encompassing all types of power. But that doesn't matter. And you know why? Because there's no other place to invest. Mexico is perfect. It's right there, 10 hours by car to produce. So all of that, all of the other issues are going to become costs that you can manage. You're absolutely right. There's no other place in the world where you can have nearshoring like you have in Mexico. No other. Not Southeast Asia. You're right there. So the old phrase of look at the U.S. So near to heaven and so close to Mexico. I think you have to turn it around and say, oh, look at Mexico, so close to the United States. I think that's becoming the most important advantage, no matter judicial system, no matter narco, no matter. But if you don't take care of them, that will become a huge problem, and then it can start costing you. Today, I don't think it will, but sooner rather than later, it'll be a cost that will change the dynamics.
Stephen, I want to, build on what Francisco just said about the investment naturally will come to Mexico for all the reasons that he just discussed. But I think there is one looming factor over USMCA, over North America, and particularly the US-Mexico bilateral relationship, and that's the China factor, right? Especially for the United States, I think a lot of folks kind of look at the China factor as solely a trade issue, when in reality it also encompasses national security issues. So I'd love to hear your take on sort of how China plays into the North American region, whether there's a clear policy from Washington as to what it hopes to do with China. Again, I had heard from the previous panel that it has like a 4 Cs, right? Sort of outlook in terms of China. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of the candidates and what we can expect with increasing Chinese investment in Mexico. Still pales U.S. investment, correct?
Right.
But nonetheless, it's something that the U.S. is monitoring.
Right. So I think, the best thing that's happened to Mexico is the U.S.-China trade tensions and U.S.-China trade war. We're speaking about proximity to the United States. That proximity has always been there, right? So what's different about this current moment?
Yeah.
This current moment is different because the United States is re-embracing industrial policy. And that industrial policy means massive investments directed towards industries in North America. And that's a huge, huge advantage for Mexico. And I think both candidates recognize that the threat that China poses, both geopolitically but also economically, and the threat that actually has played out over the last couple of decades. I spoke earlier about the influence of lost manufacturing jobs on protectionist sentiment in the United States. Both candidates recognize that the U.S. has to re-embrace a new economic model that relies less on China and more on local production, and Mexico stands to benefit from that. So what I was speaking about earlier about these institutional reforms in Mexico and how they can kind of gum up the gears of this integration isn't to say that that integration is not going to continue, but what are the ways in which we can facilitate it? I want to think about the ways that Mexico can move from 1.5% growth to 3-4% growth, right? And I think that those reforms and the way they play out and the way that the Sheinbaum administration implements them is going to be really important here. But I think, from the U.S. perspective, China we're turning a page on that relationship, and it's becoming one of more of North American integration. On the other hand, though, and I criticized the Biden administration on this point, and the Secretary of State in particular, he put out this big piece in Foreign Affairs, Blinken did, that got published yesterday. And it's all about the new U.S. approach to the world. 5,400 words, on this thing in Foreign Affairs. Go ahead and read it if you like, if you want to fall asleep at night. But Mexico, not mentioned one time. 5,400 words, Mexico's not mentioned, which makes zero sense to me, right? Given the important relationship both we have culturally and economically. So I hope that the next administration starts to begin to pay more attention to growing that relationship in a way that's beneficial to both countries. It's going to take both sides of the border to work on that. I think everyone, all policymakers recognize the importance of Mexico for the U.S. economy, the importance of the economic relationship of North America for, I think, as we've noticed now for decades for automobile production especially, but now increasingly in a host of manufactured goods. And now as we move towards the development of microprocessors and other more high-tech goods, I think it's going to continue to be important. But it's one of these things that for whatever reason, it's really not part of the national discussion or the national conversation. It's not something that policymakers focus on in speeches. And I think really it ties back to my earlier point about there's this tendency in certain parts of the country that are electorally very important to view trade as something that has not been beneficial to them. And therefore speaking about North American integration to those voters sounds like, okay, here's more lost manufacturing jobs. The old Ross Perot, the giant sucking sound of jobs that NAFTA was going to entail, I still think that rhetoric resonates more with the American public than one of integration being beneficial to all three countries in North America, unfortunately. But that has to change.
Well, I want to get your sense in terms of how the private sector here in Mexico is looking at opportunities with Chinese companies and Chinese investment growing here in the country. What is your experience or your perspective on it?
Sure. The landscape's changing drastically. And we've never seen such a high interest from Chinese investors to come to Mexico. And the numbers sort of explain it on their own, right? If you look at foreign direct investment into China, I think it peaked in 2021 with over 340 billion that was directed towards China. And that number has drastically changed. Last year was around 35 billion. So it's a tenth of what it used to be 3 years ago. And that has some serious implications. China is going through a very difficult moment, and it's got to do something because foreign investment is not going into China, number one. Number two is the country's not growing anymore. There's a big risk of China going into deflation mode. And that has serious implications. Just the economic engine that has been there for the last 20 years in China is no longer there. So what does that have to do with Mexico and what are the implications? Well, the implications are very simple. The Chinese government and the Chinese companies are looking for avenues for growth because that growth is not going to be fueled by the domestic demand anymore. And they're not going to be able to export like they used to. And so, I was looking through the economic report of the president over the weekend to, prepare for this session. And you look at it and it's right there. Who is the United States trading more with in the world? Mexico. And of course, it's a sensitive topic because you can't go into an election and not address the concerns of the U.S. voters that are trying to protect their jobs. And so it's not there, number one on the agenda for sure. But it's a reality if you look at the numbers. So I think we got to be very careful because the investors are knocking on our doors. And I can tell you, sitting on my office, I've never seen so much demand from Asian and from Chinese investors that want to see companies, want to build partnerships, want to build factories, want to play in the nearshoring reconfiguration. But we do have to be careful. We have to make sure that we take care of our national content. We want to be successful at renegotiating the USMCA. And we got to be careful. But there are implications. I think they all play in our favor. And I do think that investors are very excited about all of this. There's events occurring in the country that had never occurred before. The New American Alliance was here last week. They brought in excess of 400 members, investors that are some of the most important investors in the United States here last week. The Milken Institute is coming to Mexico this month for the first time ever. And so, yes, it's a reality. It's not speculation. Investors are interested in investing in Mexico, and I think it's just going to be very interesting to see how the new administration is going to welcome them. We did hear it 2 days ago as well. President Sheinbaum said she welcomes, investors, local and international investors, and that she's going to look for ways to make sure to protect those investors and those investments and to allow for those investments to continue to come. So I think very exciting. We got some very exciting months ahead of us for sure.
I like your optimism. Francisco, what about your thoughts on China and Chinese investment in Mexico? And Daniel, I'd love to get your thoughts afterwards on how it has played out regionally as well.
I was in a panel a few hours ago, and there was a person who had a company called Nearshoring, and he spoke about China. I said, do they know the problem they have? I was thinking for myself, do they know that? And he was talking about how the small companies and large companies with Chinese, et cetera, are there. And it's a big problem. And you have to really understand it because it's going to become part of the debate. And I think the only obstacle to the renovation of the USMCA is that. That's the only one that's going to be top of mind. And you need to understand that any investment of China here is going to be under a huge telescope, a huge microscope. So I don't know if the business community understands that and has the careful consideration of how that can impact the rest of the economic ecosystem. You're seeing it with the cars. right now. You're starting to see it, and you're going to see it in another aspect, which I think is important. I don't know if you know Temu. Temu is becoming huge in all of our regions. It's very cheap things at a relatively good quality, and you're going to see Temu destroying a lot of the small and medium-sized industries in our countries. I have no doubt that in 2, 3, 5 years, Temu is going to be, you're going to have duties on things that you buy on Temu, etc. That's the way China is trying to grow, exporting. To a certain extent, they say dumping. Brazil is having an issue with that type of. So the China issue and China not growing, they're not dumb. They're going to say, I need to grow. How do I grow? And they're doing everything they can to do it. And it's going to have an impact on all of our countries, and it's going to have a special impact here because in 2 years, you're going to have the negotiation of the USMCA. So first, you need to understand, you need to look at it, because if you don't, they're going to look for you, and you're going to have problems. Other than that, God, you're in the perfect heaven right now. I just see it. Wow, Mexico is in the most important moment of its economic history, and it can become such a powerful country. The first industrial modern country in Latin America you can become. And you see all those big dark clouds and say, it's easy to get them out. So it's a little bit frustrating to see. And I look at Colombia and say, oh my God, look at Colombia. And I see America, I'm like, drooling. And so sometimes to be very sincere, I say, oh my God, do they don't understand that in the moment they're in, it's incredible.
I agree with everything you said, and it's what I was alluding to when I talked about easy mode. It's really hard to mess this up. But coming from a country that has the world's biggest oil reserves and no food, it is possible to mess things up even if you are playing on easy mode. And I do not think that Mexico has gotten anywhere near that. But I do think that there has been real damage done in the last 6 years. The regulatory state is much weaker, which was something that Professor Weymouth pointed out. But also something that Mexico never had that almost every other country in Latin America did have was a almost complete disconnect between the types of people who go into public sector and the types of people who go into private sector at the level of human capital. And I've been working in markets for 12 years, and I've been teaching at the Kellogg School of Management for 10 years. And the one Latin American country where I would have Mexican students choosing between McKinsey and Pemex, or choosing between Goldman Sachs and Hacienda, was Mexico. Every other country, Brazil, Chile, if they went back after Kellogg, it was because they were the scion of some family business, and Mami, Papi were dragging them, kicking and screaming, back to work for the family business that had paid for their education and their wedding and their houseboat. But that was the only way it worked. And you could see that. Pemex presentations to hedge funds were polished. They were smart. The graphs did not look like Argentine graphs with real numbers. They were real graphs. And that was something that helped Ecopetrol, because when Pemex started collapsing, then you had this weird little bubble where Ecopetrol was sort of the last serious state oil company in town, which then Petro ended. But that's the beauty of Latin America and the struggle of Latin America, that you do not have to swim faster than the shark. You have to swim faster than the other countries. And that is, I would also say, a word of caution, because yes, Mexico is on easy mode now. Building a tren through the Yucatan would in many situations seem like a very silly idea, but a time when you don't know if global warming is destroying the Panama Canal and Colombia still has those 4 little ferrocarriles that never meet in the mountains, then maybe that's actually a really smart thing to do. But those windows aren't permanent. Yep. The loss of Mexico's ability to weave those narratives, to have that very professional, educated class representing the government and telling that story, you're right, it may not matter now. But in a world where, say, next year, the much-awaited sub-sovereign default wave hits China, and suddenly China doesn't seem so scary as it did before, which could happen, or a world in which Colombia has an election and starts getting its act together. And hey, guys, we have two coasts. There's some mountains in the way, but we're very stable, and we didn't default back in the 90s when everybody else did. You could see those narratives coming out of Colombia, and you could see a situation where you would get a little bit more competition. The tragedy of Latin America is that Latin American governments never waste an opportunity to waste an opportunity. Historically, it is the one thing you can set your watch to in a very, very unstable region. And I worry that that is what Mexico is doing.
Pablo, quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. So I think that's right on. I don't think the Kellogg graduates are going to come back to work for us in the near future, for sure, unfortunately. And it's a shame because Mexico had that, and that made it different. But there's an alarm that needs to go off, and there is a wake-up call pending here. And I think the wake-up call has to do with the economic situation. And if you look at the trade deficit that Mexico has today, and we cannot afford to continue to operate the economy like the way we've been operating it today. I think we've had a deficit that is the largest deficit that this country has had in 30 years at 6%. We've never been with a level of debt like the one we have today. And, we're dealing with it fine today, but we gotta change things. I'd like to think that the current administration is aware of those needs, and we're hoping for those issues to be addressed. But yes, I am optimistic, but those issues are real. Yeah. We need to address them. There is a way to mess things up, for sure. Let's hope that doesn't materialize, because I think the odds are really in our favor, and if we do it, we have the opportunity to do it right. Yeah. Hopefully that will be the way things will turn out.
Last remarks, any last thoughts that any of you may have? Yeah, Stephen, should we start with you?
Well, sure, I'm always happy to take a minute or two. So I just want to, a couple of notes, since I know there are a lot of business leaders here in the room. I'm here from Georgetown University. I'm a professor, and we're sponsoring the event here with the Baratta Center of Global Business at Georgetown. But I just wanted to reach out to you to let you know that in the coming year, starting in January 2025, I'll be leading a course at Georgetown with our MBA students working on consulting projects for businesses who are located in Mexico City. And so they'll work in teams of 4 or 5 students on a project of your choosing at no cost over a 3-month period. And then they'll come to Mexico City for a week in March of 2025 to present their results to you. So if you find that interesting, please do reach out to me, and let's work on a project together, speaking of integration and commercial diplomacy. So hope we can make that happen.
That's forward-looking and also a good call to action. So Francisco?
Don't take your eye off drug trafficking. It will corrode your institutions. It will become a parallel state. And as a victim of kidnapping by Pablo Escobar, if you think that it's going to go away, or if you think that it's not going to harm you because you're not pushing against it, etc., you're wrong. It'll bite you in the ass if you don't look at them, and if you don't really confront them as they need to be confronted.
Daniel?
I figure if everybody's plugging their classes, I teach a class on nation branding at Kellogg, and one of the things that I've been sort of struggling with a little bit is figuring out how Mexico, and what is it about Mexico that it has made it so hard for it to really create that narrative historically, which, even if all of the positives are in your favor, at the same time, I think that maybe the government tends to talk past the private sector in a certain sense, or the messaging to constituent groups that the government needs to cultivate tends to be very much at odds with what the external investor wants to see, and they haven't quite figured out the channels to communicate that without it winding up on the front page of the FT every 3 days. I would love, while we're here, if any of you have stories, experiences of things that have been misinterpreted, or frustrations of how it is to make that pitch. I'd love to hear about it and to learn more about what that experience has been like on the ground during the next couple of days we're here or afterwards. So please reach out.
Pablo.
Super. And now that we're in the topic of education, I think each one of us can do a lot. because we live in a very polarized world today. And one of the reasons why that is the case is because when we sit down at home at dinner and we talk to our kids about what's going on in the world, a lot of the conversations that we have are polarized. And I think we need to start talking more about how do we collaborate and how do we understand each other. I know, I make the same mistakes because when I sit down with friends and family, I tend to express my point of view maybe without much consideration of what others think, especially when you think about politics and about trade. So I think each one of us can do a little bit of difference to, sort of demystify some of these ideas that I think at the end of the day, when our, politicians that are running into office have to cater to an audience that is going to listen to them. So I think each one of us can do a little bit of that.
Thank you so much. And I think the overall takeaway is that on all issues, security, trade, migration, there's, we need stronger integration. We need more cooperation between the three countries. There are issues that need to be tended to, but I think overall, the North American way is successful and, hopefully will continue to be in the near future. I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us in this exciting conversation. The North Capitol Forum encourages everyone to continue these conversations. And so thank you everybody for being here. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.